Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. How are you doing? Today you probably won't hear the wind because it's not windy, but you will probably hear airplanes. I don't live near the airport, but sometimes I can hear them. It depends on the plane, on the size of the plane. So, for today's video we have a story worthy of a movie, and it's a thriller. It's the story of a man who tried to kill his father several times until he finally did it with the blade of a samurai sword. Yes, you heard it right. A samurai sword. Was it for money? Was it for revenge? Do you want to know how things unfolded? But first, let's start from the beginning. At the time of the crime, Michael Martin Jr. was 25 years old. He was from Esk in Queensland. He was married and had children with his wife Candice. Michael worked as a civil engineer for a living. He was a skilled martial arts fighter. Financially, Michael Martin Jr. and his wife were facing major struggles. Michael had personal debts. He owed $70,000 in credit cards, and they also had a mortgage. Michael had an abusive childhood at the hands of his father, who was an alcoholic and a drug user. Michael Martin Jr. was neglected and suffered years of physical abuse, which resulted in hatred, resentment, rage, and a need for revenge against his father, Michael Martin Sr. To free the couple of financial demise and also have the things in life they always wanted, Michael told Candice he had a bright idea. He said he could take an insurance policy on his father and then kill him. So in late 2013, Michael Jr. reconnected with his estranged father, Michael Sr., whom he had not seen for a few years. Michael Jr. and his wife Candice's plan started with Michael Jr. taking 3 life insurance policies separately in February 2014 on his father's name, with One Path, Clearview Wealth, and Zurich, all of them combined worth of $2.5 million. After months of planning, Michael Jr. and Candice were ready to kill Michael Sr. Michael Jr. would do the deed. Candice wouldn't be there. So on April 6, 2014, Martin Jr., Candice, and their 3 children visited Michael Sr. in, wait for it, I'm going to botch your name, in Murwillumbah. I think this is correct. So he met him for lunch. Michael gave his alcoholic father a large bottle of homemade whiskey. He knew his father wouldn't resist it. Then he drove his family home to Queensland for an alibi, and then he returned that night to his father's home to carry on with the plan. On the early hours of April 7th, Michael invaded his father's unit. He used a sledgehammer to kill his father and attack his father's friend in a violent attack. Both victims went to the hospital. Both survived. Michael Sr.'s injuries were really serious. He lost sight in one eye. He had multiple fractures, dead bowel, septic shock, and he needed dialysis. He was in a coma for several weeks, and then he still had to do some rehabilitation. While his father was at the hospital, Michael tried to kill him again by injecting him with a toxic brew of substance, which included blood, bile, and feces. After weeks of recovery, on June 12, 2014, Michael Sr. was released from the hospital, and his son Michael Jr. was there to pick him up like a devoted son. He drove his father back to the unit where the attack took place so they would collect his belongings because he was afraid to stay there. They went to a local pub, they had drinks, and then they went back to the unit to spend the night. In the early morning of June 13, 2014, Michael Jr. attacked his father while he was asleep with a samurai sword. He stabbed him 16 times in the head, neck, and chest, but this time Michael Sr. didn't survive the attack. Then Michael tied himself up. He laid on the ground outside the unit and asked for help until someone found him and called the police. Michael told the police somebody had invaded the house and attacked his father and him. He said he had nothing to do with it, and he also said that he could hear his father's throat being cut. Michael did some interviews in the media. He asked for information on the violent attack he and his father had suffered, which resulted in Michael Sr.'s death. Michael Jr.'s behavior after his father's death raised a lot of suspicions with the police. In July 2014, a month after the attack, Michael completed a claim form for one of the insurance policies. He signed it and Candace witnessed it. And he kept on going. On August 15, he contacted the police to request documentation so the insurance claim could be processed. At this time, police would assume the attack was financially motivated and the son probably had something to do with it. But things didn't end there. Michael and Candace went to Fiji, which you could see from photos of them smiling together. During investigation, the investigators found a Bunnings receipt which showed Michael had bought tape, gloves, cleaning products, and ropes the day before the attack. And because the police was suspicious of Michael Jr., they used phone taps and recorded Michael and his wife. In February 2015, Candace sent Michael a text ending the relationship and also telling Michael to stop feeling sorry for himself regarding his father. The recording also led to a letter Michael Jr. had written confessing the murder, which was found at a desk where he worked as a civil engineer. In that letter, he wrote about the first attack. He mentioned he felt guilty for losing control, but not for what he had done. He also mentioned the fact that he had endured turmoil for 25 years. Regarding the second attack, he talked about the pain his father had caused him, and that's why he carried out the plan. With all of this information, the police questioned Michael Jr. about his possible involvement in his father's death, and he, of course, denied it. However, on March 15, 2015, Michael Martin Jr. was arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, and bodily harm with intent. The police had Michael Jr. in custody, but one thing became obvious. In those recordings, the plan to kill Michael Martin Sr. had an accomplice, Michael Jr.'s wife, Candace. On April 8, 2015, Candace was heard in a recording confessing to helping Michael, lying to the police, and she also stated she knew what had happened to the missing murder weapon. On April 9, 2015, Candace Martin was arrested and charged with accessory to murder, attempted murder, and other charges. In September 2017, Candace pleaded guilty to attempted murder and being an accessory after the murder, and this is when the police found out Michael Jr. had tried to kill his father while he was in the hospital after the first attack with a brew of blood, bile, and feces. Candace also stated she gave a false alibi for the first attack on Michael Sr. Regarding the relationship between Candace and Michael, in one recording, Candace called Michael Jr. an abusive asshole. Two of them divorced. She was sentenced to 9 years in prison with parole after 4 years. Michael Martin Jr.'s trial lasted 7 weeks. During trial, the defense tried to convince the jury the letter Michael Jr. wrote to his wife wasn't a confession, it was just an expression of emotions. He was mentally unwell, and the Crown suggested the crime was financially motivated. Michael Martin Jr. was found guilty of murder and attempted murder. During sentencing, the defense stated it was a crime of revenge and retribution from a childhood of neglect, deprivation, violence, and abuse. But the judge said even though there was evidence of abuse, violence, and neglect, the crime was cold-blooded, it was a brutal attack, and it was for financial gain. He sentenced Michael Martin Jr. to 37 years in jail with parole after 27 years and 9 months. During the first attack, Michael Jr. used a sledgehammer, balaclavas, gloves, and jerry cans, which were burned. The samurai sword used to kill Michael Sr. Candace stated she cleaned it with acid, then she filed it down, and then she dumped it in bushland. Here's the thing, Candace said Michael Jr. was abusive, and it's quite interesting that this guy got a revenge, killed his father because of all the abuse he suffered during childhood, and and it was full circle. The abused became the abuser, and this is not uncommon. Sometimes people move on, they recover, they have trauma, but sometimes others become the abuser themselves. At the end of it, all that caused tremendous pain to Michael Martin Jr., the violence, at the end of the day, he committed violence himself.